I'm gonna ask you a difficult question, but how do you tell the difference between a kid that's very confident and confidence and ego?
Okay, that's a great question. And it's a simple answer. Confidence comes from the reps. Confidence comes from the practice. Guys really putting in the work when no one's looking, really going into that dark side, like we call it. And ego is not doing it. That's just how I look at it. Ego is something that can be made up. Confidence you cannot fake. You can't fake confidence. You can't steal someone else's confidence. Ego is something that's made up, something that you maybe can portray.
Hmm.
But confidence comes from the work you put in, the countless hours that you put into your craft. That's the only way. Guys that live in the gym, guys that's always in the weight room, guys that are watching tape, those guys typically have the most success, and that's where the confidence comes from. So that's the difference between ego and confidence to me. Ego is something that you can fake. You can fake it till you make it with ego. Confidence is built in from resilience, hours of work.
You said something earlier about how you bring some of that chaos onto your field and like put the quarterbacks in different situations that
Yes.
may be stressful. Is there an indicator for you when someone's been trained in air conditioning and very comfortable versus someone that's been out there in Dallas heat uh, and trained for chaos instead?
No, most definitely. You can always tell when you're doing the right training because you're prepared for every situation. When you're not prepared for every situation, you'll go back to the drawing board saying, okay, I wish we would have done that. I wish we would have done this. What I love to do, and I tell guys all the time, this will be the hardest thing you will be involved in. The game won't be this intense, or nor will your practice be this intense. I intentionally make the lab because the word you just used, chaos. Quarterback is controlled chaos, and if you're not training for a tornado, if you're not training for a hurricane, if you're not training for that, you're not going to be able to handle it when it comes. If you're training for sunny days, you know, uh, gumdrops and lollipops, if you're training for that, it's going to reflect when the pressure rises. I was blessed to play on the highest level, to coach on the highest level as well, but to coach on the highest level in high school. And so all of my training, my mindset is on that standard, is on that speed. Playing in the coaching in the state championship, I take that to my training session. So if I don't see the proper speed, if I don't see certain things, it's not gonna work on high school. It's not gonna be able to work. That's what I'm saying to myself. It's not gonna work
Mm.
because I've seen the highest level of high school. I've seen the state championship. I've seen guys that have success in the state championship in front of 100,000 people, and I just always take that to the lab. We train
Mhm.
hard to win easy. It's one of my methods.
Mm.
Train hard,
Mhm.
win easy. And that's how it should be. The game shouldn't be difficult. The game is just having a nice uniform on and performing. The
Mhm.
training, the practice, that's when the crucible training, that's when that takes place. And that's when the transformation takes place. It's all about the lab. I'm a science guy. And I explain to kids, some know, some don't. Why do you think we call it the lab? We're experimenting, we're making mistakes. We want to make the
Mhm.
mistakes in training. So when we get to the game, it looks like, oh man, this guy is just born to do it. But they don't see the countless mistakes nor the countless
Mhm.
hours of work.
That brings up so I'm a behavioralist by nature, and so really study behavior. And one thing you said, that last statement, going through a million mistakes, right? How
Yes.
do you, how do you, as a coach, as a mentor, in a day and age where kids want to be so unique, but they're so afraid to take chances and be different? I find that a lot of times kids aren't willing to attempt because they're afraid to fail.
Yeah.
How are you combating that? I know that's off script, but I would like to know.
Because, and that's a great question, because I tell guys all the time, that's a great mistake. That's a good mistake, because I know what you're thinking, and I know why you made the mistake, because I just gave 3 to 4 directives at you, thrown 3 to 4 directives at you. So I can tell, again, like I said, quarterback is all cerebral. So sometimes guys are thinking about the point I just made, and it may have the throw may be off. It may sail on you, it may nosedive, but I'm looking at from the feet to the crown of your head, and I can tell, okay, you're thinking about what I just said about your footwork. Make sure that hip and that shoulder is to the outside. We don't want to miss inside on the out. So it may throw your timing off on the out, because you're trying to make sure that hip, that shoulder is faced towards the sideline on the out. So little things like that. And I think a lot of guys that are way better than me, that are coaching on a higher level, we all have the same, a mistake to me may not be a mistake to someone else. If that makes sense, just like yourself, when you're watching basketball, someone else might say, good shot, but to you, nah, you shouldn't pass the ball. It'll come back to you. So it's kind of that in football also. The elites, they have a certain eye, and for me, I understand that you're making that mistake, because of the directive I just gave you versus you just can't make that throw. I know how to tell the difference.
Mm-hmm. All right, so this is probably where I think it's going to be the most connected to the basketball, football.
Okay.
How much of quarterback development is really emotional development on the field?
Well, it's all cognitive.
Mm-hmm.
It's cerebral. It's all cognitive, and the main word that always gets thrown out from quarterbacks is poise. You got to be poised.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. You got to be poised in the quarterback position. You got to be far the emotions go. You don't want to say mild tempered, but you got to be able to weather the storm. You got to be able to stand the rain. Missy Elliott had a song, I Can't Stand the Rain. You got to be able to stand the rain. I like to say, when it pours down, when it starts raining, you got to remain poised. You got to be able to stand the rain, and that's why it just comes down to what I was saying, in the first question you initially asked, what is a real quarterback? All those things. There isn't, he has 1 and 2 and doesn't have 3 through 10. It doesn't go like that. The guys that we see on Sundays, the guys that we see play big time college or any college is a blessing. The guys that we see play past high school, they have the traits. They have the emotional intelligence. They have the cerebral strength. They have the leadership qualities. They have fast eyes. So it just all goes together. They're poised, and if they don't have it, that's why there's different levels of college. That's why there's different levels of professional. That's why there's A and B teams in high school. It's not a knock on you. You just may not have all of these tools, but you do something good, or you may not do anything good, and then you're not going to play. But the guys that are playing on a certain level, they typically get the poise. They have the leadership, they have the emotional intelligence, they have the awareness, and the cognitive strength. They're strong mentally. Quarterbacks are strong mentally. It's a thinking man's game. You got about 2 seconds, 2.5 seconds to scan the field, make an elite play. It's definitely not a position for everyone, but the ones that do succeed in it, have success in it on whatever level, you definitely should pay homage to them, because it's a tough task being a quarterback.
So let's take a few key points, right? We talked about poise,
Yes.
and that carries over to the point guard, to the shooting guard, to all facets, but
Yes.
most importantly to the point guard, I believe. And then you said decisions, you get 2 seconds. And when we get to working with our elite, our college guys, we tell them 1, 2, and it's got to be done. It'll
Yeah.
either pass it, shoot it. It's just got to be done. But I'm sitting here as you're describing poise, emotional intelligence, all these pieces. I'm reminded of a shot taken at the Noble at the buzzer when Youngin made it and won the game. And it was a great moment for me watching it because I've seen Jarrett at different places,
Yes, sir.
and he caught my attention right off because he walked into the arena at Tarleton, and all of a sudden people were drawn to him.
Yeah.
So I know that charisma, poise, all those things. So it's interesting to me watching you as a father, watching you how you've worked with him, so to speak, but raising him, right?
Yes, sir.
He's confident, he's not arrogant, he's a humble person, he's great to be around.
Yep.
But I will never forget that shot at the buzzer at the Noble. I'm not sure who the opponent was, but I'm
That
damn sure
was Paris Episcopal.
oh man.
Tell you a funny story. And the creator and the head guy of Noble, great friend of mine. Love him to death. Him and his family, great guy. But Jaron missed that shot 2 times prior in his life. The first time was in the 8th grade in middle school. He had a chance to win the game, and he missed it, but he never ran from the moment. The second time was AAU, summer of 8th grade, going to his 9th grade year. He had another chance. He didn't play as much, but he got in. It was a new team. He got in towards the end of the game, and he took the last shot, rolled in and rolled out. So to see him make that shot, not even that, but to never run from the moment, to never run from being in a position to have to make that shot, and then finally making it, almost as if he proved something to himself. To finally get over that hurdle, that was just remarkable. That was remarkable, and that was big for him also. Goes back to the emotional intelligence. It did something for him to finally not let my team down, for lack of better words, because all leaders take upon a big role, and they carry a load on their shoulders, so to finally help his team out and get over that hurdle, man, that was a sight to see, something I'll never forget.
Yeah, you're right. All right, so let's hop back into this because I think this is a big piece about the pretenders and contenders.
Yes, sir.
What are signs that a quarterback is mentally fragile, but physically gifted?
So that's funny you say that. We got a saying where we say, looks like Tarzan, plays like Jane. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So there's a lot of guys like that. We all know. And, one thing I would say is I judge QBs on what do you do when you're down? And I always give quarterbacks this example for myself. When I played professionally in Germany, my first initial game off the airplane, it was 3 interceptions. And I didn't understand German at that time, but I know they wasn't saying kind words, in German because, hey, we just flew this guy 7 hours. What's up? We're expecting him to come perform. And I never lost grasp of who I was. I never winced nor cried aloud. One of my favorite poems is Invictus. 6th line of Invictus. I never winced nor cried aloud. I never even doubted for a second. I ended up finishing the game with 3 touchdowns. We lost by 2 points. But I'm saying, to answer your question, I always judge a quarterback on when you're down or when the game is on the line. How do you respond? Is the moment too big for you? Do you go in a shell or do you bust out? Some guys are not practice players. Some guys may not wow you at practice, but in the game, you're like, who is this guy? I've never seen him Monday through Friday. Who are you? So coaching is just a great experience. Like seeing kids step out of their shell, and then, like you said, seeing some kids who physically, they pass the test, the eye test, because that's very relevant. But then when they're in live bullets, it just doesn't translate over. Some of that is for preparation, and some of it is just, you're not ready for the moment, So I always judge it off. What do you do when the times get hard? When the going gets tough, the tough gets going. So I always judge it off that.
Mm-hmm. So I got so caught up in your answer, but I'm thinking, body language. We know that's important. We know
Yeah.
that the offense feeds off of the quarterback. But what are some of the things that feed the offense even when the quarterback's struggling? Like how do you teach them to maintain, like, your 3 interceptions?
Yes, sir.
Come back with 3 touchdowns. How are you able to translate that or see that in your guys?
I don't think it's something that you can teach. It's innate. It's one of those things that, like I said, it's a trait, it's a characteristic, and also the preparation. Or do you have a kid prepared to where I feel good coaches can make a player play beyond his potential? And it just comes from the preparation. It comes from the environment that you introduce. People like to say your players are a reflection of you. So it really answers that question. If you're this guy, your players should resemble that. They just should. So that's how you can judge it. You do put a lot of credit on, I wouldn't say credit, a lot of criticism on the coach. But at the same time, you do have to start looking at the kid, at the player, but it starts with the coach. If the coach is not giving you the environment, it goes back to that question before. If the environment is not getting you ready for a tornado, getting you ready for controlled chaos, then when the heat turns on, you're probably going to fold. So you just always want to see who's coachable. You want to see who can take the tough coaching. Are you fragile mentally? One of my coaches used to say, "Are you a mental midget?" Are you fragile up there? And if you are, we can tell, because you're gonna crack when times get hard.
Yeah, and it's interesting, man. Kind of the parallel of football, and you see guys highly successful, and we're talking about levels to this game, right?
Yes, sir.
Really successful quarterbacks in high school, and they struggle or they excel at the next level in college. And then when they try to make that leap into the NFL, it's such a small percentage of guys that can make it. And I think that was a good point way back when we were talking about A team, B team, C team.
Yes.
There's a place for you, and it's not a bad thing or a good thing.
Not at all.
Where are you at on that spectrum,
Definitely.
All right. So we see a lot of different quarterbacks across the globe.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of quarterback do players naturally follow? Or is that even a fair question?
No, it is, because the position is leadership. So guys follow. I'll never forget, because all the questions just bringing back memories, and I can vividly remember a time where I took over. Again, I just had the 3 interceptions. Came back with 3 touchdowns. Okay, guys are starting to, they're starting to respect what's going on. Okay, he is maybe thought he is. Then the second game, I would never forget, ended up being one of my close friends. We still talk on social media all the time. There was a mishap on the play, and he walked off the field and was kind of mouthing, just out loud to the team and all that. And I made a point to go and find him, and we walked off, and we were face to face, and I was just, I had to take the bull by the horns. I had to understand that was my time. And I'm not thinking this at the moment, but I had to understand that was my time to let guys know James Mitchell is serious. This guy is a leader. We can walk in the dark alley with this guy. And I'll never forget, you know, they bought my dinner after that. Every
Mhm.
game, every week, they took care of me. They respected me, but it wasn't a disrespectful moment. It was just me saying, hey, man, I'm the quarterback of this team. This is how it's going to be, and you're going to have to get with it. So just not being afraid of confrontation, not being afraid to voice yourself. And it goes back to that confidence. You can tell when someone has confidence by how they speak, how they coach, how they attack their craft, how they approach their craft. It's mainly that, just taking
Mhm.
advantage of those times to lead and not being passive and not allowing one of your teammates, to make you go into a shell or whatnot. But guys naturally follow leaders. And it's not about someone who just talks it. Someone who walks the walk also, they will naturally follow, because the only way you're allowed to lead is that your peers and your teammates allow you to. So you can't lead someone they don't want to follow, and they won't allow you to. And the only way to be a leader of men is to, for one, be an example of a man, and to just walk the way you talk, walk it how you talk it. That's how I look at it.
And that's translatable. That's not just football. That's
Definitely.
leadership in business, in different rooms. That's leadership everywhere.
Yes, sir.
Oh, so let's get back to some intangibles. Like
Right.
when you're looking at developing quarterback, what are some of the intangible soft skills that you're looking for?
So when I'm looking into developing quarterbacks, I'll start with the young guys. I've been having a lot of youth ages come my way, and one thing I tell parents, it's not necessarily an age; it's about comprehension. Can they comprehend what I'm trying to give? Can they pick up, you know, the drills I'm trying to do, the ball mechanics of throwing, the basic throwing mechanics? Can they pick it up? Is it over their head? Am I speaking a different language to them? So it's all about, um, can you get what I'm trying to give? Can you pick up what I'm putting down? It's mainly that. It's not very difficult. Quarterback, you can't reinvent the wheel. A
Mhm.
lot of people have a preference to certain things, but it's all the same. But depending on who you're around, it might be a different preference, like the slide of the ball, where to hold the ball at. Some
Mhm.
guys like earlobe to sternum. Some guys like right above belly button. Some guys are sternum. So it's all the same. I think it just depends on what what part of the spectrum that quarterback is on in his walk. You know,
Yeah.
um, but the main thing is just, are you coachable? Are you? So let's rewind. Can you throw? Because if you can't throw the ball, then we have nothing to talk about. You know what I mean? So there have been
Yeah.
situations where you can coach a kid, you can teach a kid, but I was always taught, just toss a kid the ball when he get out the car, just play catch with him. Talk about his school, what his favorite quarterback is, what did he eat on the way here, what did he eat today, and just see how the ball jumps out of his hand. Some kids can throw the ball tremendously, but their footwork is bad. Those are the to me, that's what I look for. Can you
Mhm.
throw the ball? I can teach you footwork. Footwork is something everybody doesn't know. But how do you look just throwing a football? Does it jump out of your hand? Is it great throwing motions? We throw circular, not linear. How do you look throwing the ball? That's the first thing. And if we have a hard time there, then it's going to be hard to do everything else. But the first thing is, can you throw a football? And how do you
Yeah.
look throwing? Does it look comfortable? Does it jump out of your hand? I typically would like to just have footwork as an issue. I just would, because that lets me know, okay, you got a chance at this. The ball jumps
Mhm.
out of your hand. They call it a live arm. You look good doing it. Coach Larry Kennan, old school NFL quarterback coach for the longest, Coach Brady, Drew Brees, one of my strongest mentors. He always say, James, it's just how it looks. It has to look good. How does it look doing it? And if it doesn't look
Mhm.
good, then that's typically our answer right there. But just how do you look throwing the ball? That's the main thing I look for.
So many things correlate between athletics, life, in general. So, what do you hope that your quarterbacks take from the trainings, not just the physical development, not just the emotional development, but what is the one thing that you want them to take away when it's all said and done?
That's a great question. I can remember the first state championship that I was a part of in 2022. And I told a kid, you take the same work ethic that you use to win state and you apply it to life and you'll be just fine. You know, so that's the main thing I look for. I want guys to understand how to be able to push through obstacles. That's one of the main reasons I make the lab intense. And that's one of the main reasons I you know, it's not all fun and games all the time. You know, we're really putting in the work because I want you to take from this how to have a strong work ethic and apply it in everything you do. That's what I really would like for you to take. For one, that me as your coach, I try to be a reflection of God as far as showing love, being kind. So I always want that first to come off that, you know, Coach Mitchell loves the Lord. Coach Mitchell openly talks about his faith with God, you know, and I hope that can pass over to you to where you can understand, okay, it's not something I should hide or need to hide. You know, real men can speak about their faith, whatever that may be, you know, so that's the main thing. And then secondly, the work ethic. You know, I got to work hard to get what I want because quarterback is a big deal. It's not something lightly that I'm doing.
You know, I think that that's a great closing to what we're talking about. Man, I really appreciate your time, and
yes, sir.
I might need to do this again because, hey, I like hearing your stories, but so much translates back and forth without you even realizing it. You know?
Yes, sir.
But again, man, thanks for jumping back on, and thanks for joining us, and we'll talk again soon.